So I finally have got her, Tiffany Cross. I've been a fan. I've been watching. I've been throwing all kinds of social media stuff her way, and she mine. And we've got a social media relationship. But this is the first time we've been talking that we've talked, and we've been talking for 10 minutes before I press record. Very happy to have you. Congratulations on your book. That doesn't come out till July, but everybody should pre-order.
Thank you so much, Pete. And let me just say, I love your voice. And when you're on, you always add, and these times I'm so angry, but you always add this tone of kindness and compassion and come togetherness. So, bravo to you for being able to maintain that sense of just humanity in these times.
So what, thank you very much. What do you think that it is before we get into the guts of the book, which is so good? And we're just going to have to do more interviews because I'm barely probably going to scratch the surface, even though I've read almost the entire thing and I'm so prepared. But what I wanted to ask you, like, what frustrates you? What do you think it is about people who don't understand racial injustice or people who aren't curious about it? I guess I've always just been curious about it and been wanting to learn more. And I'm always embarrassed, as I was when I was reading your book, that I didn't know a lot of things that you wrote about, especially in the historical part of the book, which is so good. What what do you think about people who aren't curious about racial injustice?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't typically engage people who aren't curious about things. I think that's how this country has started to destroy democracy because there's a lack of intellectual curiosity. And that has helped people buy into this false narrative about who America is. And that's why people are able to perpetuate that lie and help fuel systems of white supremacy that this country was built on. When you think about the massive amounts of wealth that Black people created for this country as an enslaved people and have never been the beneficiary of it. And so when you hear, a lot of people who lack that kind of curiosity and who seem to always say, like, let's move on from issues of race already. But when it comes to what happened to the Jewish community, it's never forget. When it comes to 9/11, it's never forget. But when it comes to Black people who built this country under violent white rule, through backbreaking labor, it's let's move on already. And fuck that. Like I don't support that. We can curse on your podcast, right? So use the beat
I'm
button.
allowed to, guests or not.
Oh,
Uh,
sorry, beat me out.
can you imagine? Can you imagine? Anything you want, of course. Yeah. So, what do you think? Per what you just said, how important do you think it would be for the federal government, much less a state or local government, to memorialize slavery the way they have in Brazil, the way Germany did the Holocaust in Germany? Because I've heard a lot of scholars say, it wouldn't fix anything, but what we need to do is admit how horrible we have treated Black people from the beginning. We need to admit that. And one way to do that would be some major memorial. We have, the African American History Museum in DC, which is fantastic and which took forever. But what do you think about some kind of memorial to slavery, which is an admission of our past?
Well, I'm not holding my breath for it. And I don't know if that's going to really connect with the people who are still enduring the fallout of what happened during slavery. So great if somebody wants to erect a memorial. There are plenty. There's the EJI in Montgomery, Alabama, which focuses on lynching, which is moving. You mentioned the Blackstonian, I call it, but the National Museum of African American History and Culture. That's a few blocks from me. I mean, these are all amazing things. But when you get to the meat of what's happening, the meat of trying to level this playing field and acknowledge the atrocities that the American government committed against Black people, there is a concerted effort in Congress to prevent that from happening. A gentleman by the name of Congressman Conyers was a big champion of the reparations bill. And when he left Congress, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas has picked up that mantle. And so she's not even introducing legislation to offer reparations. The only thing that she's asking is to create a committee to study the impact of slavery in every industry, in every space of American culture. And even that has been met with resistance by the GOP-controlled Senate. And I don't even know if there's consolidation in the Democratic Party for this. I could be wrong, so fact check me there. But the point is, I think people are so eager to move on that they are afraid to face what happened. They're afraid to acknowledge what happened. Because a lot of people in positions of power are the descendants of people who enslaved African Americans in this country. Even Ben Affleck, who, when he found out that his family had once owned slaves, the shame of it, he didn't want people to know about it. But what a missed opportunity, acknowledge that, yes, I did this. And because I, Ben Affleck, benefit from this, as a result, here are the action items I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that I empower Black people, that I, employ Black people, give fair consideration, that I bear witness to truth and speak up when I see someone is being disenfranchised or whatever. So as long as we keep running from it, we won't talk about it. It's like if I know, Pete, if I know that you murdered your brother, okay, and I don't want to, we agree, it's so awful that we don't talk about it. You say, I don't ever want to talk about it again. Well, at a certain point, we're not going to talk about anything, because this big shadow over what you've done is always going to be there. So if we can't acknowledge that piece, then this chasm in American society will keep growing. And that's where we are.
I don't think you even have to make it as dramatic as that. Even if you're in your marriage, if I got in a huge fight with my wife, I can't just sweep it under the rug and expect it to go away. It'll always come back. And it does, believe me, over 20 years in a marriage. If you have to acknowledge what happened, or it comes back to visit you often in many different ways. So, and you mentioned John Conyers and the reparations bill. He introduced that for like 20 years or something like that. He was in Congress. And you mentioned, just what Sheila Jackson Lee wants to do in terms of research. But as you know, there has been a ton of research on the generational damage that slavery and Jim Crow has done. And there's so much evidence as to what it has done, not only economically, but to the health of African Americans, because of what the stress literally of going outside can do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's generational trauma that exists in our communities, and we've never had the economic benefit of being able to unpack that the way that some communities do. We didn't have the benefit of sending our children to therapy. We didn't have the benefit of even acknowledging what we had gone through. When people were experiencing oppression in the early parts of this century, post-Reconstruction, there was a discord in the Black family, because Black men found it difficult to be oppressed all day, to be called nigger on the job, and to come home and have to face a child that you can't feed, to have to face a woman that you can't provide for. And so I think it has always created such heartache in our community. And then to be denied that, even to have people dismiss that pain, and to have people discount what we have contributed to this country, and discount how we feel about it. And that's only begun to change in very recent times, Pete. I think about my own mother. She was born at a time where she couldn't sit anywhere on the bus. I'm really the first person in my family born at a time post Jim Crow. And that wasn't that long ago. I think that's the most frustrating part when people say, let's move on. This shit just went down in the 60s, and things continue. They continue to perpetuate in policy. They continue to perpetuate in our finances. They continue to plague our communities and our education system. So the work has to be done. And we are just not there yet, quite honestly.
Yeah, you write in the book, white supremacy in America is like the iPhone. New versions keep coming out. Each new version does all the same things as the last, but it has a few added features. There's always some bugs to tweak in the more modern operating system, but it eventually functions as designed. It's a perfect but sad metaphor. Explain what you mean.
Well, when people say that our government is broken, and I have to call bullshit, the government is functioning as it designed. When you look at the people who founded this country, who did not consider Black people human beings. And so it wasn't so much that they, and I write about this in the book, but it wasn't so much that they wanted to keep us out of democracy. They never let us in at the onset of democracy. So when it became time to coexist with the people they'd always considered inferior, they designed a system to make sure that Black people knew that they were inferior. And so it's challenging for me. And look, voting is such a powerful tool, and what my ancestors went through to guarantee me full rights of citizenship, I don't take it lightly. But I certainly understand the Black person who is doubtful about trusting a system that was designed to not only hurt them, but keep them out of it. And so when they say, you're asking me to trust this system that has imprisoned me, that has killed my brother, kept my mother impoverished, kept my family living in red line communities, kept my children in dilapidated schools. And now you're saying casting this ballot is going to change that system. They cried bullshit too. And that's the hardest work I think that a disproportionate amount of Black women have to do, is convince them that we're not asking you to believe in this bullshit system. We're asking you to believe in you. Reimagine a democracy that you deserved. And instead of trying to convince people who are not curious about equality and racial justice, who don't feel like it's a worthy topic of discussion, I would rather convince people to have a sense of agency in their own power in shaping this democracy. And because we've for so long been kept out of it, too many people are fearful and distrustful of the way the government functions, because like I said, it's functioning exactly as it has been designed to function. So before you disrupt it, you do have to become a part of it, a part of the system, to disrupt it from the inside.
So well said, and so well researched in your book. You write all about that specific tenet, but it does seem like a really difficult mountain to climb, challenge to overcome, to convince people who for generations have been locked out to believe, as you say, in themselves, not in the system. How do you think that's going now with the new leaders of the new civil rights movement, however you want to refer to it?
Yeah, so I think it's, we've seen all of these leaderless movements sprout, from Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement. I don't know if any of these movements can have one face, that's the one voice. But I do think that people are seeing the landscape as it is now and feeling a new sense of empowerment. It's kind of the question you want to ask America. What did you think was going to happen? After 400 years of violent rule and oppression, and then you top off this vanilla sundae with this orange cherry that's pretty much saying fuck you to all people of color, to all women. And now you have this landscape of chaos. What the fuck did you think was going to happen? And so now that people are erupting across this country, it's quite understandable. And revolutions are messy and they are violent, but they are often preceded by violent acts of white aggressors. And so the violence started with police brutality. The focus is now somehow looters and agitators and aggressors. And so I think when people have that disconnect from a mainstream media that, intentionally or not, says that your voice doesn't count as much, now that, we have all these different spaces for content that has democratized the process and have given people a first line account on what's happening, I do think people have a new sense of agency. And I do think people are seeing this is literally life or death now, given the fallout of COVID-19 and now the unrest across the country. I just think there's a new sense of desire to feel empowered and to enact that. And I also think that, Black people stand to suffer disproportionately in this country when we have incompetent leaders. But Black people have survived a lot of devils. Donald Trump is not the first white supremacist in the White House. I hope he'll be the last. But there's been more bigots to run this country than there have people who are not bigoted. And so I think for a long time, Black people felt like, look, we can survive what other people can't. But too many of us didn't survive. And so now I think people are seeing, you know what? I've got to disrupt this system. And that might mean I'm out, yelling and screaming and protesting, and holding up a sign, which is fine. But I hope and pray and predict that they will also be as passionate about casting ballots come November.
You mentioned, kind of how the narrative has become about the protesters and not police violence. And I want to talk about, obviously, media with you, because you write in your book, you really kind of blow the lid off of cable news in a way that not too many people have honestly done. And the reason why I think people don't do that is because for people like you and I, it can be our bread and butter. It's good for us to be on TV. We're good
Yeah.
on TV, and to criticize the power brokers is not a great way to be invited back on TV. But I think that you do a really great job, a transparently great job, and you can't. Hopefully, I don't think there's going to be any damage done as a result of your honesty. But
We'll see.
I mean, you name a lot of names, and you have there's a lot of value, I think, to what you're saying. But one thing was eerily strange, and reading your book, where you described a white woman calling the cops on a black man for his dog humping hers in a dog park. These
Yeah.
particular white people assume that law enforcement is there strictly for them, and that when police show up, they will instinctively be on their side. This is a deeply rooted sentiment of superiority over African Americans, which has been nurtured by an unforgiving criminal justice system that favors white people. You wrote that in this book. You wrote that probably months ago. The book doesn't even come out till July, and we saw this Harvard-educated bird watcher on the Audubon Society board have the police called on him by a woman. And that was, I think maybe strike 3 in the latest round of horrific racial injustice that we've been seeing. But you weren't being prescient. You were just saying what happens all the time, right?
Right. And look, I've had these experiences with white women who feel like they have some sense of authority over me for things such as a parking space, or even, showing up in a grocery store line. And I think, it's challenging because when you encounter these microaggressions or these very direct and insightful, or aggressions that are meant to incite anger and
Yep.
spark outrage, it can be challenging to maintain your cool. And so you see that more often than not, where Black people have to go out of their way to remain calm in the face of this very irate person who has this sense of superiority that they can control your outcome. And you saw that with Amy Cooper when she talked to the very calm and docile bird watcher. She knew her power as a white woman, and you saw her switch just like that when she was on the phone and started performing, and she was dramatic and sounded like she was in fear of her life. That's what leads to the outcome of a George Cooper. So I really think, look, white women have a unique role in this space, and more power than not. And I encourage people to visit the Equal Justice Initiative, the memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, because it honors the lives of so many Black Americans who were lynched. And an overwhelming majority of these Black Americans who were lynched, which include women and children, it wasn't just Black men, just as police brutality does. An overwhelming majority of these incidents were sparked by a white woman. She either said something, made a false claim, or was aggressive with someone that led to law enforcement instinctively being on her side. And so we have to acknowledge racism. It's not just police brutality, it is the white supremacy in which police brutality is bred. And as long as we're not talking about that, I just don't know that there's a solution here, because body cams ain't it, because all that did was give us a better view of Black and brown people being assaulted or murdered. So until we get a better understanding of what's happening, and also some sort of fight back, I'll tell you, Pete, when I saw that video of the police officer kneeling on George Cooper's neck George Floyd, forgive me.
I do forgive you.
Floyd's
It happens so often. We tend to mix the names up. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. When I saw him kneeling on George Floyd's neck, I asked an officer of the court, if I were to pick up, I'm 5'2", okay, I can't overpower this man with a gun. If I were to pick up something and knock him over the head, am I assaulting that police officer, or am I saving that Black man's life from a murderer? The law would say the former. But as a woman, I feel like I'm doing the latter. And so as long as we have that chasm, everybody sit around and watch this man get murdered. I understand that. I understand the fear. But at some point, if there's a fear that you're going to fight for your life, perhaps that's the thing that's needed to change. And I know that puts a lot of people in an uncomfortable position and puts so many of us on the front lines of violence. But it's just at the point now where I acknowledge that revolutions are messy and they are violent. And I'm just a little more Malcolm than Martin in this situation, and feel like something drastic has to happen for the preservation of Black life in this country.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've gone down a Malcolm X rabbit hole the past week. I have. I'm watching the old stuff. I played some of his stuff on the podcast yesterday, and it's hard. It's very hard to know how to handle such situations and what the outcome will be. But you also write in the book, I think something about how it's not like, because I've asked this question a lot to people of color. I've said, do you think that there's more racial violence, or do you think it's just being captured on camera and documented more? And I think you in the book, right, the school of thought, it's not upticks in violence, it's just being noticed more. And I wonder if this latest round, oh God, I don't have the words to make it sound impactful enough. But all these horrible acts of violence against black lives lately caught on camera, Ahmaud Arbery, and of course George Floyd especially, if there is a turning point this time, because we've seen so many of these, the Sandra Blonde video was the one before this that outraged me the most in my opinion. I've been in that situation a lot of times, and I go off on the police officer because of the privilege that I have. But do you think that this latest round of videos is like a black spring, if you will? Like, do you think this time it's different? Somebody said to me, who was it the other day, said to me, they think that George Floyd, that video was the worst of them all, was bar none the worst thing that they'd seen. That man die that way. I don't know how you categorize such things, but is this time different?
I don't know, I mean, because it's not new. Like, we had a series of deaths caught on camera leading up to the 2016 presidential election, and we still got Donald Trump. So I don't know that this is a turning point. I mean, we talked about the Red Summer, we talked about the Civil Rights Movement, and there's always been Black blood to spill across our screens, and then we would see the needle move a bit. So I don't know that this is enough to be a drastic turning point.
It's interesting because, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to interrupt you with your own words, because I thought it was really fascinating the way that you wrote about and documented what happened in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and how that incident interrupted the already scheduled programming, which was ABC was airing the telecast of Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about the persecution of Nazi war criminals, you're right, to show what was happening in Selma, Alabama. And you write this so eloquently about what had happened there and how that seemed to really change hearts and minds. I mean, I feel like that's what you're saying. So why wouldn't all these instances of police violence that we're seeing at some point change hearts and minds as well now for this generation of Americans?
Well, I don't know that it changed everyone's hearts and minds. I mean, look, we're in the information age now. So at that time, everyone wasn't sitting around watching a 24-hour news network. This was primetime television, and they had to interrupt to see Black women and children being run down by police on horseback. That was a huge deal. So for white people who were able to go about their lives indifferent to everything, just, didn't care to pay attention about these atrocities, it wasn't like they were a secret. They just did not have to face the brutality of what was happening. Once they did have to face it, things changed, but not a lot, Pete. I mean, not a lot. Like this, it moved the needle just a bit, but not in a drastic way. And I think, I've talked to some students, and I think they ask, like, you guys did this, your parents did this, your grandparents did this, and things change a little. Like, how long before we see this real change? And I understand that frustration. And so I don't know that, watching Black tragedy porn is going to change the hearts and minds of people who are either A, indifferent, or B, have no problem with it. Some may conflate the two, but I think, unfortunately, it's going to take more than that this go round, because power concedes nothing without demand. And there may be some well-intentioned people, but not too many people are saying, I feel guilty enough, or I acknowledge this inequity enough that I am going to concede some of my power to you. That's not going to happen. You have to snatch it. You have to take it. And I feel like until we do that across the board, that's not just in politics, but until we demand by evolution or by force, the landscape will have to become more inclusive. We are the rising majority of this country. And I think as long as there's discord among all of us, it's going to be hard to coalesce and build coalitions to make that change. But that is what's going to happen. We're going to have allies across the board in every community to say, this is bullshit, and we're here to make this change. And again, revolutions are messy because there's discord among all communities, and revolutions are violent. And so we have to be prepared for that. When we see these standoffs with the police. I mean, I watched this week the LAPD take nightsticks and hit protesters. We watched the police SUV drive through a crowd of protesters. What did that look like? Charlottesville, when a white nationalist drove through protesters. So these are the things that we're seeing. It's nothing new. I just think the response has to be different at this time.
You write a lot about history, election politics, and democracy, and I think the stuff about the civil rights movement that you write about, Johnson and the Southern strategy and things, a lot of people don't really understand what happened and how the political parties changed and evolved in the 60s and who the players were. But once the civil rights movement culminated in the Voting Rights Act, and I think that what is really important, the most important thing in race and democracy to me, and the most kind of underreported and under-discussed thing, is how the Voting Rights Act was gutted by Republicans in the Supreme Court a few years back. And it's the reason why it's important is because it took all of that bloodshed and a generation-long movement to get those achievements. And the moment they were gutted, and I remember John Lewis talking about that, and how horrible it was to see those achievements. The moment they were gutted, states reverted back like that. And you write really, like, your book documents what happened, especially in Florida and Georgia and a number of states, in Ohio and Michigan, really, really well. Could you talk a little bit about why it sounds like you agree that the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which was, by the way, reaffirmed by the entire Senate, and almost every Republican, and George W. Bush, and then the Supreme Court gutted it when Obama was president. Why is that so important, that moment, and how, as you snapped your fingers, what happened?
Well, let me first just explain for those who may not know. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act said that states with a history of oppressing votes had to check in with the federal government before making changes to how people vote. When that went away, they let states run loose. And so a lot of these GOP-led state legislatures were able to reenact the same voter suppression efforts that we saw from decades ago. And so that is something that not only impacts African Americans, but it's something that disproportionately impacts Latino voters, Native American voters, older voters, even older white Republican voters. But Republicans were willing to cut their nose off to spite their face just to make sure that Black people weren't around the vote. And why that matters is because the less people who participate in civic engagement, the better it is for Republicans. So Republicans stand to disproportionately gain when people are suppressed and oppressed, for that matter. So when we saw the voting rights struck down by a conservative Supreme Court, it punctuated the point that this is why these down ballot elections matter as well. The presidential elections suck up all the oxygen in the room, Pete, but it's the Senate who controls the judiciary. It was the Senate who gave Brett Kavanaugh a welcome mat to the Supreme Court. Imagine if Democrats controlled the Senate, Brett Kavanaugh would not be confirmed, and the courts would lean left. And so all the legislation that's going to land at the on the desk of the Supreme Court, this is something that we have to think about because these things have sincere consequences. So now here we are in a very consequential election, and we have GOP-led voter suppression running rampant. We have foreign election interference that focuses specifically on Black voters. And now we have the fallout of COVID-19. This unholy trinity can have a devastating impact on this election because it has to be overwhelmingly decisive. Donald Trump has already threatened the peaceful transition of power. And so if it's close, which we should not take for granted that it won't be, if it's close, we could see this type of violence that we're seeing now behind police brutality. We could see that happen for our elections. We can see this Donald Trump wing of the party uprising and committing violent acts. We've already seen them storm the state house in Michigan, and they are disproportionately armed relative to the rest of the country. So, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but these are real live things that could potentially happen, all because the Republicans have been able to manipulate the rules of democracy to their favor, from striking down the Voting Rights Act, which led to racial gerrymandering. Political gerrymandering is not illegal, but racial gerrymandering certainly is. In North Carolina, the federal court said it was done so with surgical precision to keep African Americans out of the process. In the book, I write about Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, and Florida, where these states they're either swing states or potential swing states that have the most egregious laws that are keeping people from it. And it's not something that gets talked about in the media, Pete. I mean, there have been less than 3 stories leading up to midterms in 2018 that talked about voter suppression. For the most part, the media just bakes it in the cake. And that's bullshit. Like, when we think about stories that matter to us, that is BS, because if white women were being kept from the ballot box, it would be breaking news every night on our TV screens.
I can only imagine. I'm trying to game that out. You do a great job of talking about the importance specifically of Black women throughout history, but especially recently, obviously in 2018, and obviously in the special election. I think the place that it was most obvious was in the special election in Alabama with Doug Jones versus what's his pedophile, Roy.
Roy.
A fucking
Yeah, Roy
monster.
Moore. Yeah.
Unbelievable, that guy.
Yeah.
How close he got.
Yeah.
And how much Trump and others supported him. The guy wasn't even allowed to go to malls.
Yeah.
Because of how many young women had reported him. But nonetheless, the importance of Black women in that election was everything. And yet Black women aren't given nearly the credit that they deserve. I think in your book, probably that was the most well stated and documented that I'd ever read. Granted, I'm not as well read as I'd like to be on some of these issues, but I think you do a really good job. And you also introduced, like I said earlier, me to some historical things that I had no idea about. But you mentioned the Me Too movement, and I think that's a really interesting dichotomy because you say I felt left out of that, the Women's March. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So I didn't feel left out of the Women's March, but I think disproportionately Black women feel left out of these feminist movements. Even, the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s that painted Gloria Steinem as the face of feminism, but not Shirley Chisholm, who was certainly on the front lines of democracy at that time. And so fast forward to today.
Angela Davis.
Angela Davis for sure. And so when you look at the landscape today, there's nuance because this, Me Too movement kind of bled into the Believe All Women movement, which completely discounts the unique Black experience in these types of accusations. I, may lose an amen corner with this, but I will never ascribe to this Believe All Women mantra. When you look at the disproportionate amount of Black men who lost their lives because a Black woman made a false claim, the most famous of those being Emmett Till, but there were so many, I believe I can hear all women. I don't believe all women. And so I think these nuanced points get lost on a movement that choose white women exclusively to be their champion because they think that's a more sympathetic victim. And so when the Me Too movement happened and the Women's March happened, you saw, particularly around the Women's March, you saw a lot of white women start to feel uncomfortable and say, well, this is focusing a lot on race. Well, this was the same thing that happened around the 19th Amendment. Even now, you see the media landscape saying, oh, it's the 100th anniversary of when women got the right to vote. Well, that's bullshit because some women got the right to vote. White women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. That didn't apply to me as a Black woman. So again, I feel left out of this white-led feminist movement that never takes into account my unique history with this country. And this is happening while people who look like me disproportionately uphold this country, this democracy, and certainly the Democratic Party. So it feels like the intersectionality sometimes leads to a beef. And it's one that I don't always want to participate in.
Have you ever noticed how long your responses are on your cable news appearances?
too long, probably.
No,
I got to get it in where I fit in.
well, see, I think that you have a unique ability. Not a lot of people don't have this, and this has nothing to do with race or gender or whatever. It's personality. You have a unique ability to go for as long as you need to go. And I think a lot of times, the panel, the anchor just kind of knows, let Tiffany go. That's my impression, because
Oh, well, thank
what
you.
I'm saying is, like, you started that response about I think there needs to be more nuance. And nuance comes in a book like yours. Nuance comes in an interview like this. Nuance doesn't nearly often enough come in a cable news panel, which allows me to pivot to media, because you write so much about this. And I love that you're able to go for longer, and you carry your torch as long as you want until you're done. But even then, you realize that you got to wrap it up at a certain point to be fair to the other panelists who have thoughtful things to say, and you get that. But your book doesn't need to do that. A forum, a talk, a moderated talk doesn't need to do that. Interview like this doesn't need to do that. And all the nuance that you just included in your answer about feminism and what it leaves out is so, so important. But of course, I imagine you agree, a lot of nuance is dead because of social media, because of cable news, and so on. So let's talk about that. You're a social media star. You're ferocious on Twitter. You're really funny. You're really smart. You're really, I think, intimidating, and that's good.
I
But
hope not.
well, I mean, I wouldn't want to, I saw, who was it recently? I saw
Who
Tangled
knows? I get into
with you recently, and it was a big name person who clearly picked on you, and you just finished him. It was last week. I feel like it was a woman, but
I have no idea. I get into these Twitter beefs, and I only have 2 tweets top for people. After that, I am done. So it could have been anybody.
well, you're better than me. I'll go
If
go
you
at
tell
it.
me the topic, I'll know the person.
Get
But
what it
I don't.
was. I just remember I just remember using a fire emoji, and I remember to quote it. I remember it took me a very long time to find the fire emoji, and I was like,
It's too many
is
emojis.
this worth it? And I finally got it. No, but the point being that everything is too brief. Everything is too succinct, and cable news destroys so much. And even Sirius satellite radio was doing that for me. I'm so much happier to have a podcast, a long form conversation. But what about cable news? You started your career as a stringer at CNN, entry level in Atlanta. You write about that, and it's really heart wrenching how you write about you as a young person, because as I'm reading that and how much you kind of were ignored and were taken advantage of, and you just kept coming back for more, I was like, man, if they knew who she was going to become, how did they not spot talent? Maybe you weren't, maybe you weren't as talented then. I don't know, but
nothing has changed. I'm still not employed by any cable news network now.
Well,
so
that's my big question, and this is the hardest question to answer. I think that when Chris Matthews got canceled, got fired, that was the opportunity that MSNBC has been waiting for, to hire a Black woman to host a nightly show. CNN doesn't have one. They've got Fred on the weekends, and she's been great for 100 years, but they don't give her a lot of bandwidth. Yeah. MSNBC has Joy on the weekends, and I call her show kind of the Black News Hour in a way, because I'm she's covering so much Black news. And somebody might even argue, all you talk about is Black news, Joy, or something. I'm like, but that's because nobody else is doing it. Yeah. But that's a couple hours on the weekend, and it's it's about time. What are they waiting for? You would be perfect for that 7 o'clock spot. Put put some Black woman in that 7 o'clock spot. I've been fighting for my friend Laura Coates at CNN or MSNBC for years. I mean, what's it going to take? This is, to me, the most glaring, outrageous, upsetting thing, that there is not a Black woman on cable news, prime time, and night.
Yeah. I share in your outrage. So first, let me say that Joy's show is amazing. And I would just say that I don't know that I would say that it's Black news, because she talks about so much news that happens to be relevant to a lot of different constituencies. She's one of the few outlets where you'll hear anything about what's happening in Native American communities. I've been on there talking about disaggregating data when it comes to AAPI communities, Asian American Pacific Islander communities. So, I think, unfortunately, the powers that be.
Well, minority news. I mean,
but not even. I don't know if minority because it's, it's the rising majority now. And she also does like just regular political news. I think I've been on panels on Joy's show where it's been, the panelists happen to be all Black for this segment. But we're not talking about things that are necessarily relevant to Black people. We might make a point that's relevant to Black people, but the topic could be impeachment. And it's like, yeah, it shouldn't matter that it's all Black panelists, because the same way that you can have a panel full of white people and one person is, from academia, another person is a reporter, another person runs a PR firm, another person is married to the host, and the host happens to be a white man, Nobody's saying, whoa, this is the all-white show. They're talking about white news. It's like, no, so Joy's show, I don't even think she considers it. I think it just happens. She's like, oh, we're talking about this. We should get Ellie Mistal on. And we're talking about this. We should get Jason on that panel. Or let's get Karine on. I mean, I think these are panels that they reflect America. She gets Giassi Ross, who's, Native American, great guest. Maria Teresa Kumar, who runs Voto Latino. So I think there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to talent. But I want to answer your question, because as I go off my too long answers, I just want to make the point that I think decision makers at the cable news networks are catering to an aging, shrinking white audience. A lot of the viewers are over 60 and they happen to be white men. And I would just make the point, those cable news execs have got to realize that audience is not immortal. At a certain point, they are going to be gone, and the network executives are going to be left with this rising majority of America who they have routinely and historically ignored and not given any content, not covered our issues with any nuance or perspective, and they will increasingly get left behind. There's too much begging for attention. You've got outlets like Quibi now that's all about quick news and bites. You've got Netflix and shows like The Patriot Act, and people doing this news content, catering to an audience that looks a lot more like me and a lot less like them. So until they get on that train, they are going to get run over by it. And that's unfortunate, because I think you see right now with everything that's happening, people are in front of their television screens wishing that this kind of coverage that's giving a voice to the underrepresented could continue for longer.
Well, I'm going to try again, because I think maybe if I phrase it differently, I mean, I think that if Joy Reid has 4 hours on the weekend, she's get 2 hours on Saturday and 2 hours on Sunday. Yeah. I think, and I feel this way, and I think you write about this in the book. You talk about that there are just not nearly enough executives, much less executive producers that run the shows. That's the top person that runs a TV show, a cable news show, that are people of color or women of color. And I feel like, and I have felt this way with my show, well, I've only got enough time. I gotta squeeze all these things that are undercovered in. That's what I feel like a lot of Joy's blocks are, her shows are. And my point is, if you had those people in those places nightly, you would not feel that you had to cram all of that in. By the way, on a Saturday and Sunday morning, when not nearly as many people are watching, to their credit, they do draw in a lot of people that make, I think, it destination viewing on the weekends at MSNBC. They've done a great job with that, but that's not when most people are going to be watching. It's during the weeknights in those primetime slots when they get top ad rates and all that shit. That's what I'm saying. Like, it should be spread out over every night for.
Agree.
And I'm just saying it's concentrated on the weekends.
No, I don't disagree with you about that. The only correction I would say is that even though people aren't typically watching news on the weekends, you typically do see a drop off. That hasn't been the case with Joy. She pulls in the same numbers as Morning Joe does. She's averaging over 1 million viewers.
How is that not a lesson for the programmers? Like, based on those statistics.
Exactly.
Like, plug her in at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock on MSNBC, whatever. I mean, I think Rachel Maddow seems to be the only one that seems to be actually, making them money. And I love, Chris Hayes, and I love Lawrence, but I mean, in terms of like getting the ratings to sell the ads, like if that's the only thing that counts to executives, and it is really, then fine, put a Black person in there and draw it every night.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not even a paid contributor on any network. So I don't understand what the litmus test is, what the value add is, how they determine who is worth getting paid for their time, who contributes. I'm very thankful that I have a lot of people who like what I have to say, and and I'm thankful that those people will follow me to different platforms. If I'm on CNN or I'm on MSNBC, the same people will switch over, and they'll say that, like, I'm just tuning in to see you. So, I think Joy has carried the mantle for so many people at that network. Yeah, I think when you walk into MSNBC offices, like, I'd like to see some pictures of Joy on the wall, because they have a lot of pictures of their talent around there. It's like, and you feel like, the
So
character
glaring.
in Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing. Why ain't no sisters on the wall?
Well, yeah, but that
Like,
kind
where's
of thing, like that kind of thing is so glaringly obvious to
yeah,
anybody who has just any kind of semblance of curiosity or equality. Like, where are the women? Where are the people of color? I mean, you write
that's
about
right.
MSNBC promoting their, the women of MSNBC, and that was a huge mistake for them. And there was a
Yeah,
huge backlash for them because there was a bunch of white women, and you're like, are you
yeah.
fucking kidding me?
How did you not see that? Did nobody notice that? And this is why I say white women have a unique role, because nobody's mad that the white women were profiled. That's fine. I don't even know what the fuck the story was. Like, show me any network that doesn't have 5 white women on TV. But fine. You want to celebrate them? That's great. But this is the role that they could have played. And maybe they did, because I don't know. But somebody could have said, well, guys, shouldn't we include Joy in this? Because she hosts a show on the network. And right now we're just all white women on this show. The PR department, could somebody say, well, wait, this isn't very diverse? LA Times themselves that ran the article, could they say, do you have any diversity at the network that we can highlight? But we have to keep demanding it. And the crazy shit about all this is, Pete, Black women disproportionately watch MSNBC. Our eyes and our dollars fund the network.
Should have
That
made
does not
that. Should have
always,
made
yeah,
that point. Yeah, I should have made that
yeah,
point first. Yeah,
yeah.
you make it in the book. I know I'm running out of time with you, but I want to ask you one more thing about something I learned this year is really important and fascinating, and I think that you put it, and I copy and pasted this in my notes in a way that nobody else has put it so eloquently, just the way that you're framing of it. But you have this great, I forget, I should have the notes, what chapter it is, but
If you tell me, I'll be able to tell you.
well, you write about Ralph Northam and the
Oh,
governor of
yes.
Virginia. And you say, this is the guy who obviously, hold on, they're coming to get you. What is
I
that?
know. I live by a fire house, and so
Oh,
with all the
really?
unrest, I hear sirens all the time. So
Oof,
I'll tell
just used to
you,
it. How
while
do you
we're
deal with
waiting to
peace
go
and
by,
quiet?
I'm so used to it. And so while
Can
we're
you
waiting,
sleep? Can you sleep in peace and quiet?
yeah, this is like background noise to me now. Um, with all the unrest happening in DC, I will hear the sirens on my screen and outside of my window.
Oh,
So I hear
nuts.
it all the time, but it sounds like they're quiet now. So go ahead. Sorry.
So you write about Ralph Northam being caught in this scandal with blackface, and then you write about the fact that the other guy, the next guy in line, had allegations from a woman against him for sexual assault, Justin Fairfax, and it's really this whole section here is interesting because basically the point that you're making is about black voters and why they might vote the way that they vote. And when it comes to Joe Biden, I think he's a perfect example here of this, which is you're saying that black people just don't, they have to trust that white people are going to vote for this person before they do. It's not their favorite choice. If they had their favorite choice, there'd be a long list of candidates that aren't even running. But it's more about who's the most likely person to get elected. We'd rather keep Ralph Northam as opposed to what could be.
Yeah.
We'd rather have Joe Biden because we think, whether or not it's right, we black voters, especially older black voters apparently, think that he has the best chance of beating
Yeah.
Trump. Explain what I'm trying to muddle
Yeah.
through because I can't find the exact quote in your
No,
book.
I got you. I think black voters are very pragmatic, right? Look, it's not that black people are so excited about Joe Biden, but when they saw that, white voters were willing to cast votes for him, and said, okay, even when it came to Barack Obama, black people liked Obama, but they were concerned, like, it's just not his time. We don't know that white people will vote for him. After he won Iowa, it changed a lot of people's outlook. And so I will tell you, it's very frustrating to me to see a lot of the Bernie people so upset because Bernie didn't make it, that they're saying they're not going to vote. And to me, this punctuates privilege, because do you think that I, as a Black woman, have ever been excited about casting a ballot for the people that we've had to vote for, save for Barack Obama, because I was genuinely excited to vote for him. But for the most part, you know how many devils Black people had to vote for? But what do? We pull our shit together and we go and save democracy time and again. So for all these people who are tweeting and pouting and like, it should have been Bernie, I'm not voting. Get the fuck out of here with that. You know, like, it just seems like you don't give a shit about this country the same way we do. And we built this bitch for nothing, you know, like, it's ridiculous. And you have people who are just, throwing a temper tantrum and taking a shit on the country because their, favored candidate didn't make it. And it's infuriating to hear that. And I'll tell you, it's equally infuriating to see cable panels of people try to explain this and get it wrong time and again. You'll have a panel full of white people trying to dissect the Black vote and get the entire narrative incorrect, which is why I titled the book what I did.
And it is such a good book, and everybody can pre-order it right now. I learned so much in reading it, and I'm really psyched to finally connect with you. And I think that I don't know. Who did you write the book for, I guess? Because I want to say I know who I want to read this book. And I wonder when you were writing the book how much you thought about your audience, white men,
a lot,
white women.
So I wrote the book for Black voters, or really Black people who have been so discounted out of democracy. But I wanted to be very clear, because anytime I write something, a lot of times I'll write something about Black people or people of color, and I always make a point to say, but this is about Black people. It's not exclusively for Black people. Everyone should read this. And so when you're writing a book, the process I found is helpful if you're writing it to someone. So I shouldn't say I wrote the book for Black people. I wrote it to Black people. But I want everyone to read this, because I think the difference in the audiences will be that Black people will say, yes, say that. I completely agree. I think there are a lot of white people who will say, what? Huh? I never knew that. Like, how did I go? There'll be some Black people who read it and say, what? That happened? I never learned about that in school. How was it possible that I lived my life as a Black person and never knew that? I think there will be, if media isn't so defensive, if the media landscape could read this and say, you know what, she raises some really good points and we should do better. So there is a large swath of constituencies, candidates, people who want to run for office. And it's like, well, I don't really know how to reach out to Black voters. I made a specific point to have a chapter just for you to say, this is a better way to engage my constituents or Black people. So really a large swath of constituencies, I think, I hope we'll find this book informative, helpful, sometimes entertaining, sometimes infuriating. But either way, Pete, I have to tell you, I'm so excited to talk about it with literally everybody. July can't get here fast enough. I was excited that you invited me to do this, but it's COVID times. And I happen to know that you and Ellie went for drinks, and I want my drinks with Pete whenever life opens up again.
Well, we didn't. Okay, but you're not insinuating that we had those drinks before COVID.
I know, pre-COVID. I'm just saying, because it's COVID, you and I
don't want
to.
You don't want to drink with Ellie during COVID in a loud bar, because I'm telling you right now, there's a lot of spittle.
A lot of aerosol.
There's a lot of spittle that happens in a loud bar. Ellie,
I can imagine.
Ellie does not have an inside voice anywhere.
No, he doesn't. That's why we love him.
Of course, yeah. From the moment I met him, one of the most profound sentences in your book is the candor. The candor in this book may leave some gatekeepers troubled, and I was like, I'm a gatekeeper. And I
people need to be troubled, and I had to be comfortable making people uncomfortable. So
do you mind ending our interview with the section I emailed you? Can you check your email?
Oh, yes, I will check my email. You see the sun is slowly creeping up this side too. So it's going to cook me in a minute. All right. America was not founded on peace and prosperity. It was taken from the Native Americans with blood and fury. It was not built on equity and equality. It was built on the backs of the enslaved. The country did not allow opportunity for everyone. It afforded power to a privileged few. Their American dream was our American nightmare. Black people lived in constant fear that the power of white people could at any moment and without any notice devastate their entire world. Let's not feign surprise when white supremacy rears its ugly head again and again and again. It's a system that is as American as apple pie and as old as the Battle of Jamestown.
I love it. I mean, I hate it, but I love it.
Thank you, Pete.
Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy is a book that you can order right now. Pre-order right now. Get it up on top of advanced books, and follow Tiffany on Instagram and especially on Twitter, where I basically go to your timeline like a couple times a day, but like, ooh, I wonder if Tiffany's tweeted anything. Get all excited. Stay safe, and congratulations.
Thank you so much,
This book
Pete.
is so good, and it's clear that you put a ton of research and a lot of hard work into it. And I'm a much better person for having read it.
Thank you so much, Pete. And thank you for sharing your platform with me and inviting me on. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
Anytime you want, every day. Let's do it. We should do the co-host a podcast. All right.
Exactly.